In the silence before dawn, across landscapes once thick with grain and the low murmur of livestock, a different sound begins to rise. Not the cry of war, not the crash of falling walls, but the quieter, more relentless absence of what should be there. Empty granaries. Fields that refuse to yield. Children whose ribs press sharply against thin cloth. Across centuries and continents, entire societies have discovered that the foundation of civilization is not gold, not stone, not even the will of kings, but the daily presence of food. When that presence vanishes, the structures built upon it begin to lean, then crack, then fall. What follows is not merely hunger. It is the slow unraveling of order, of trust, of the shared belief that tomorrow will resemble today. The collapse does not announce itself with drums. It arrives first as a whisper in the soil. Long before the first empty plate appears in the historical record, the land itself holds memory of abundance. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Nile floodplains, the terraced slopes of the Andes, and the volcanic soils of Pacific islands, communities once measured time by the ripening of crops and the return of herds. Daily life moved to the rhythm of planting and harvest. Women ground grain at dawn, while the air still carried the cool of night. Men repaired irrigation channels or watched flocks on distant hills. Children learned the names of edible plants before they learned the names of kings. Markets hummed with the exchange of barley, maize, dried fish, and preserved meat. Festivals marked the seasons with songs that thanked the earth for its gifts. In these ordinary hours, no one spoke of collapse. The future felt as solid as the walls of the granary. Yet beneath the surface of routine, subtle shifts were already at work. Rainfall patterns began to change in ways too gradual for a single generation to fully notice. Soil that had once been dark and rich grew lighter, thinner, exhausted by repeated planting without rest. Forests that had sheltered game and held moisture were cut for fuel and building, leaving the land more exposed to wind and sun. In some places, populations expanded beyond the quiet capacity of the fields. What had been enough for a village became strained for a city. The early warnings did not come as prophecy. They came as smaller harvests, as longer walks to find firewood, as the first arguments over water rights. People adapted, as people always do. They planted more, worked harder, stored what they could. But the margin between enough and not enough was narrowing, and few understood how thin that margin had become. By the time the signs grew clearer, the systems that once buffered scarcity had already begun to stiffen. In the highlands of the Maya world, intensive agriculture had transformed wetlands and hillsides into productive mosaics of maize, beans, and squash. Cities rose in stone, their plazas filled with the smoke of incense and the voices of traders. Yet the same intensity that fed the cities also depleted the soil and demanded ever more labor. When multi-year droughts settled over the region, the reservoirs that had once held life-giving water began to shrink. In the North Atlantic, Norse settlers on the edges of Greenland watched their pastures thin under a cooling climate. Their cattle and sheep, once symbols of prosperity, grew leaner. The seals and fish that had supplemented their diet became harder to reach as ice patterns shifted. Across the Pacific, on isolated islands, the cutting of trees for canoes, statues, and fuel left the soil vulnerable to erosion. Each society faced its own version of the same quiet arithmetic: more people, less reliable food, fewer options left unused. The pressure did not explode all at once. It accumulated in decisions made under the belief that the old ways would hold. Rulers continued to demand tribute in grain even as yields fell. Rituals that had once celebrated fertility were intensified, consuming more resources rather than conserving them. Trade networks that might have brought relief were strained by conflict or simply by the shared scarcity of neighboring lands. In some places, elites maintained their own stores while the common people faced shorter rations. In others, the entire community tightened its belt together, rationing carefully, hoping the next season would restore what had been lost. But hope is not a harvest. Each failed planting season, each thinner herd, each empty fishing ground pushed the society further from the equilibrium it had known. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began with the quiet calculation of how many mouths a dwindling store could still feed. When the system finally began to fail, the failure was measured first in the bodies of the living. Children stopped growing at the expected rate. Nursing mothers produced less milk. The elderly, already frail, grew weaker faster. Disease, always waiting at the edges of undernourishment, found easier passage through weakened immune systems. In the Maya lowlands, skeletal remains from the period of decline show clear markers of nutritional stress. In Greenland's Norse settlements, the archaeological record reveals a shift from cattle to seals, then to whatever could still be scraped from a harsher sea, until even that was not enough. On Easter Island, the once dense population faced a landscape stripped of large trees and the resources they once provided, leaving people with fewer tools, fewer canoes, and less capacity to fish or farm effectively. The land that had sustained them no longer answered in the same way. Social bonds, once held together by shared surplus, began to fray under shared want. Theft of food, once rare and heavily punished, became more common and harder to police. Families that had cooperated in planting and harvest now guarded their remaining stores. Accusations of hoarding or of supernatural interference circulated in the places where explanations for the failure were sought. In some societies, authority figures who had claimed special connection to the forces of fertility lost credibility when the fields remained barren. In others, those same figures tightened control, extracting what little remained to maintain the appearance of order. Violence, when it came, was often local and intimate rather than grand. Raids on neighboring fields, clashes over the last reliable water sources, the quiet abandonment of outlying settlements as people moved toward whatever centers still held food. The great monuments continued to stand, but the daily life that had given them meaning was already thinning. As scarcity deepened, the very idea of the future contracted. Long-term projects, new temples, expanded irrigation, distant trade expeditions were postponed or abandoned. Energy that once went into building was redirected into mere survival. Knowledge that had been specialized, the careful understanding of soils, of planting times, of animal husbandry, risked being lost as the people who held it struggled simply to eat. In the most extreme cases, the social contract itself fractured. People left the cities for the countryside, or the countryside for the cities, seeking relief that no longer existed in either place. Some migrated outward, carrying what they could, leaving behind the ruins of a life that had once felt permanent. Others stayed and watched the institutions of their world grow hollow. Courts that once dispensed justice now focused on the distribution of dwindling grain. Armies that once expanded territory now struggled to feed their own ranks. The human cost was not only physical, it was the erosion of the stories a society told about itself. When the land no longer provided, the narratives of divine favor, of ancestral wisdom, of inevitable progress, began to ring false. In the silence of empty granaries, people confronted a truth older than any empire: that civilization is a temporary arrangement between human need and the generosity of the earth. That arrangement can be stretched, managed, even temporarily forced, but it cannot be ignored indefinitely. The societies that ran out of food did not all vanish in a single generation. Some endured for decades in diminished form, their populations reduced, their ambitions narrowed, their once complex institutions simplified into the basic tasks of staying alive. Others fragmented into smaller groups that remembered the old abundance only as legend. The long-term impact of these collapses reached far beyond the people who lived through them. Abandoned cities became stone libraries of warning, their empty plazas and overgrown fields studied by later generations who rarely recognized the same patterns in their own time. The Maya collapse left a landscape of monumental ruins that later travelers would attribute to mystery rather than to the slow arithmetic of drought, soil exhaustion, and overextension. The Norse departure from Greenland left behind farms that the ice and the sea slowly reclaimed, a reminder that even determined settlers can be undone by a climate that no longer cooperates. On Pacific islands, the loss of forests and the resulting scarcity reshaped not only diet but the entire social order, leaving behind statues that watched over a quieter, more constrained world. Each case added a chapter to a larger story. That food is not merely sustenance, it is the quiet architecture of trust, of hierarchy, of the belief that the world will continue to answer human effort with harvest. In the centuries that followed, new societies rose on the same soils or on distant ones, often repeating versions of the same sequence. Expansion, intensification, the quiet narrowing of margins, the arrival of a stress that the system could no longer absorb. The difference was rarely technological cleverness alone. It was the capacity to recognize the early signs, to adjust before the stores ran too low, to treat the land not as an infinite storehouse, but as a partner whose limits must be respected. Those who failed to do so left behind the clearest evidence of what happens when the partnership breaks. The ruins do not speak of sudden catastrophe so much as of a process that, once advanced far enough, becomes nearly impossible to reverse. By the time the signs became clear to everyone, the options had already contracted to the few remaining paths of survival or departure. The lesson written in the empty fields and silent cities is not one of moral judgment. It is one of measurement. Every society lives within a budget of soil, water, climate, and labor. When that budget is overdrawn for too long, the debt is collected in the most intimate currency, the daily meal. The people who faced these collapses were not less intelligent or less determined than those who came after. They were human, operating with the knowledge and pressures of their time, making decisions that seemed reasonable until the cumulative weight of those decisions became unbearable. Their story is not distant. It is the oldest story of organized human life, rewritten whenever the balance between appetite and earth is allowed to tip too far. And so, the fields that once fed empires now feed only the wind and the quiet growth of whatever plants reclaim the abandoned ground. The granaries stand empty or have crumbled into the same soil they once stored. The voices that argued over the last measures of grain have long fallen silent. What remains is the evidence of a process that began not with drama, but with the ordinary failure of the ordinary. A harvest that came up short. A season that did not turn. A store that, when opened, revealed less than expected. From that quiet beginning, entire worlds were rearranged. The collapse of societies that ran out of food is not a single event in the past. It is a pattern that waits, patient and precise, for any civilization that forgets how thin the line is between enough and nothing at all.